My name is Sherry Potter. I'm the manager of the Membership and Community Programs Office at the American Institute of Biological Sciences. This is our first experiment with hosting a virtual web party to celebrate 2 new books that have come out from distinguished colleagues. With us today on the call is Carl Zimmer, who's going to share with us information about his new book, The Tangled Bank, and Chris Mooney. We're very excited to have them join us, and we think you're really going to enjoy the presentations. And we're very thankful to both of their publishers who've also offered us a couple copies of each of their books to hand out to lucky participants who will be selected in the duration of this call. There's 2 ways that you can communicate with the presenters during the course of this event. The primary way would be through the chat server that's available on your menu to the left side of your slide deck. If you have any questions that you think of during their presentation, please feel free to chat those questions right into the screen. And when we get to the Q&A period, I can help queue them up for the presenters, and you can unmute your line to join us and ask them yourselves, or I can ask for you through the chat mechanism. I'll give you instructions for unmuting your phone at that time. But in the meantime, I hope you all join me in welcoming Carl Zimmer to share with us some more information about the Tangled Bank. Thank you, Carl.
Hi. Thanks, Sherry, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I was going to talk for a little while about my new book, which is called The Tangled Bank, An Introduction to Evolution, and also talk more generally about actually writing about evolution in what can only be called interesting times. We've just finished up last year celebrating Darwin's 200th birthday and the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And today, Darwin's influence on science is enormous. Basically, his theory of evolution is the bedrock on which modern biology is built. Nevertheless, if you take a look at some recent polling data, you can see that a lot of people have some incorrect notions about the history of life. This one just came out the other day. 366 people in Texas were interviewed by the University of Texas, and as you can see, most of them disagree with the statement that humans developed from earlier species, and 30% agree with the idea that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time, and 30% don't know. So I don't mean to show the slide to pick on Texas in particular. This is just the latest in a long string of surveys that show that there is a substantial opposition to evolution in the United States. For example, nationwide in a poll, roughly about 45% of people say that humans were created in the last 10,000 years. So a couple years ago, I was approached by a textbook publisher about the possibility of writing a textbook for non-majors. Professors were telling him that there just wasn't a good book around for that particular audience and wondered if I'd be interested. I jumped at the chance because really I kind of do that already in the sense that I write articles for places like the New York Times, and I write about natural history, I write about the natural world, and in order to do that, I have to write about where all that natural history came from. So in other words, I've got to write about evolution. So I've been doing that a lot in various forms, and so it was really interesting to me to try it in a textbook form. So one thing that I wanted to do in this book, The Tangled Bank, was to get across some of Darwin's key ideas and to give a sense of how they continue to be incredibly useful for biologists understanding the natural world. The great thing about The Origin of Species is that Darwin is presenting one overarching explanation that can explain a lot about the incredible diversity of the natural world. I mean, these are pictures from some of Darwin's books. I mean, Darwin loved just how diverse the world could be, the natural world, from flightless birds to beetles with giant horns to beautiful orchids to bats with wings. And what he strove to do was to express with his theory of evolution. The one thing that I want to focus on right now is the idea he had that all the species on Earth around us are related to each other through common descent. And this is a notebook where he first drew a picture to represent this idea, and it is a tree. And so Darwin would argue that basically there's a tree of life that species branch off from common ancestors through natural selection and other processes. So I wanted to use that as much as I could as a way of just communicating how scientists understand evolution and how they make sense of things like, for example, snake venom. So there are lots of different genes that venomous snakes have for making venom. And there are lots of different versions of the same kind of venom genes. And so scientists can actually compare them to each other, and they can compare them to other genes, and they can figure out how they're related to each other. So, for example, we have hemoglobin genes, and chimpanzees have hemoglobin genes. We inherited those hemoglobin genes from a common ancestor. So when scientists take all this genetic data, they make a tree. They make a modern tree of life. So here is a figure from one of my chapters in my book where I'm looking at a venom called crotamine. And it turns out that crotamine evolved from a protein for killing bacteria. And it's actually a very common kind of protein. We carry a version of it too. So scientists can see how genes that evolved with one function shifted over to a new function, like venom. And what's nice in the textbook is that you can actually use this tree in different versions to get across the same point. So here is a case where I'm combining pictures of genes with branches, with the animals that have these genes, to kind of give you a sense of how it is that a mouse could have a gene that's related to a snake venom gene in a rattlesnake. So what's really amazing when scientists have done this kind of research is that they've actually discovered that snake venom genes are in animals other than snakes. So this pink bar here, these pink bars show the acquisition of venom genes, and it actually started before snakes evolved. And the common ancestors: snakes, iguanas, monitor lizards, glass lizards, and Gila monsters. And so this has led scientists to look at lizards in a new way, and actually to try to find some of these lizard venoms, as it were, because it turns out that venoms can be used as the basis for new drugs. And now we have a whole new supply of potential drugs out there in the form of these amazing creatures here, like this lace monitor lizard. Now, medicine is actually a big part of my book, partly because it's where human health and the natural world really come together, and it's also partly because evolution has been yielding all sorts of fascinating insights about our health, and so medical researchers are more and more getting involved in what's known as evolutionary medicine. And a great example of this has to do with the flu. So, for a long time, nobody knew where the flu came from. The name influenza actually means influence, and so people thought that that the stars were influencing you when they gave you a fever and you were snuffly and achy and just wanted to stay in bed. By Darwin's time, people knew that there were things called viruses, but they didn't really know what viruses were. And the slide I'm showing here is just a case in point. Darwin was a real tech nerd. I mean, he loved getting fancy pieces of scientific equipment. And this is as good of a microscope as he could get his hands on. And so obviously you're not going to be able to see the incredibly tiny microscopic viruses that cause influenza with something like this. Well, after Darwin died, scientists began to discover that the flu viruses are little packages of genetic material. And what's really important about that is that means that they actually evolve and experience natural selection and all the other processes that Darwin believed that animals and plants did. So there are things like evolutionary trees for viruses. And these trees are really important because, for one thing, they can tell you where the flu comes from. They come from birds. So this is a tree showing all the influenza strains that are found in birds. And the ones that cause influenza in humans actually are in those little, just a couple of those wedges. So you may have heard of the H1N1 virus. That's in that group of H1 viruses there, most of which only infect birds. But every now and then there will be one of these viruses that's adapted for birds will kind of spill over into humans, and most of the time it's kind of a dead-end experiment. It's just extinction, which is just a fact of life when it comes to viruses or anything else. But then there are cases where the virus has a chance to adapt and to actually be able to spread from host to host. So when scientists study influenza, they rely on evolutionary trees. This is what I'm showing here is a modern version of Darwin's tree of life, but it's virus strains. Unfortunately, the color key there got a little jumbled. Basically, the different colors show different places where these virus strains have been found: Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And this is a tree that scientists put together to show sort of how flu viruses circulate around the whole world and evolve as they do. This evolutionary perspective has also allowed scientists to figure out where new strains of influenza come from. So this new strain that came up last year, scientists have been able to trace its evolution back not just to one common ancestor, but actually to a few different flu strains. They combined with each other. They sort of have a virus version of sex, and the genes experienced natural selection and then combined some more with some other pig viruses, and voila, you have the swine flu of 2009. And by discovering the evolutionary origins of this flu, we're realizing that we actually have to pay attention to where these flu come from. And they don't always come directly from birds. Now scientists realize that pigs are a really important reservoir for new kinds of flu viruses. They've been called mixing vessels for the flu. And so there will be new flu strains evolving in the future, and there's a good chance that some of them, at least, will be coming out of pigs. Now, virus evolution not only illustrates Darwin's tree of life, but it actually sort of shows how we have to elaborate on Darwin's ideas. We have to get a richer sense of how evolution actually works. So, as the descendants of a common ancestor evolve, they split off from each other and they become more and more distinct from each other. However, for viruses and for bacteria, which actually make up the bulk of life on Earth, it's also possible for genes to move from one organism to another. It would be kind of as if we were shaking hands and I passed you my genes for my brown eyes, and suddenly your eyes turn from, say, blue to brown. So this actually is going to require some new ways of thinking about evolution. And let me just move to the next slide here. Whoops. So we have to look at whether the tree of life is the most powerful explanation for how life evolved, or maybe a web or a tree-like web, a web-like tree. In any case, the pictures like these, which I include in the textbook, can help people to understand these concepts even as they're starting to develop. Now, the reason I think that the pollsters here chose these particular questions to ask is because they're hot button issues, and they're the thing that people really want to know. They really want to know, ultimately kind of about ourselves. And when you ask people, did we evolve from an earlier species? I think there's sort of an idea that implicit in that is, are we just monkeys? Are we nothing more than apes or something like that? And that's something that I understand that readers will bring to the book perhaps. And so what I try to do is I try to bring forward the evidence that we have for the evolution of life. So we have the fossils, and then you can combine that into trees like the one I'm showing here, where you can show all the different traits and also show step by step how we evolved. So it's not that we're monkeys. There are monkeys still around. They're our cousins, and we are unique. But then again, the monkeys are unique too. So finally, I just wanted to wrap up by just talking about this last question, which makes me think that maybe the pollsters need to read this book too. Humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time. The assumption is, well, that's not true. But there have been a lot of fossils discovered in the past couple of decades that are revealing stunning similarities between birds and certain kinds of dinosaurs, two-legged dinosaurs called theropods. They had feathers. These theropod dinosaurs would nest just like birds do. In fact, there's a whole huge amount of evidence pointing to birds actually being dinosaurs, being living dinosaurs. And so here's another one of these diagrams that I show, trying to put together some of this evidence. So, if someone would ask me this question, I would ask them if I could rephrase the question, and then I'd say, absolutely. So that's the portion of my talk. Sorry about the funny slide there, but my website's carlzimmer.com, and you can find out more about all the stuff I was talking about there.
Great. Thank you, Carl. I just want to compliment you on this textbook. I think it's extraordinary. That artwork is beautiful, and I have to confess I've been reading the book cover to cover, and it's the first time I've ever enjoyed reading a textbook cover to cover.
That was the goal.
So thank you. I've been reading it for pleasure, and it's been just wonderful to work with. So we'd love to open up the floor for any questions that you as participants might have for Carl. As I mentioned before, there's two mechanisms for communicating with us. One would be through the chat server, so if you're feeling not quite confident yet, jumping on the phone and letting us know what your question is, feel free to chat it there, and I'd be happy to help ask the question for you. Or alternatively, you're welcome to dial *7 to unmute your phone and join the call. Don't be shy, but if you want to just raise your hand, we'll call on you one at a time so that everyone doesn't unmute at the same time. Start with our first question coming from Michael Barton. Michael, do you want to ask your question yourself by pressing *7? Okay. Michael's question is, do you know of any schools using your manuscript yet as a textbook?
Yes, I'm happy to say that my publisher has been getting a number of messages from professors who are said that they like the book and they're going to adopt it for their upcoming courses. It came out in October, so I think some people are starting to use it this spring, and certainly a lot more are going to be using it in the fall. Fantastic.
Next question is from Sarah Gage. She wants to know if you have a link to the University of Texas poll results.
I tell you what, I will put a link up on my blog, which you can get to through my website. It's called The Loon. And I'll just, if you want to just Google it quickly yourself, just use the term Texas Tribune. That's where I came across it. And the title of the article is called Meet the Flintstones.
Great. Jen Skeen, would you like to unmute your phone by dialing *7 to ask your question?
Hello?
Hey, Jen.
Hi. My question is, Carl, whether you write with a particular reader or audience in mind, and whether that audience is different for the Tangled Bank versus for your newspaper articles and your blog.
That's a great question. The audience is still the same. I mean, basically, I want to try to write for as many people as I can. So I would hope that a motivated high school student would be able to get through one of my pieces. The style is a little different from case to case. So in the textbook, you have to really get into the nuts and bolts of, say, genetic drift, whereas in a New York Times article, you can kind of move kind of quickly through it. You use a few metaphors about flipping coins, and then you're done. So the audience is the same, but the style is different. Not too different.
Thank you.
Great. Next question coming from the chat. Recently, there have been data presented that birds with flight evolved from gliders in the trees and not small terrestrial dinosaurs. Are you familiar with those data, and what is your opinion of that research?
Yeah, so this is a big debate. I mean, whether birds evolved from dinosaurs that were up in the trees or were down on the ground. In any case, in either case, the majority of paleontologists agree that these were theropod dinosaurs that were either up in the trees or down on the ground. They're just all of the traits that they have in common really point to that. It's possible that it's not sort of an either-or question. You know, you may have had animals that were running around on the ground and scrambling up trees and being up in trees, and maybe gliding was sort of part of their repertoire. It gets hard to really work these things out, but there's been some really interesting advances with all these spectacular feathered dinosaurs that have been discovered recently.
Next question from Ido Friedberg. Would you like to dial *7 to unmute your phone?
Yes. Hi, Carl. I was wondering what, I haven't read The Tangled Bank, but I have read with great pleasure The Water Edge and Evolution, the Birth of an Idea, and I was wondering what The Tangled Bank gives in addition to these other two books.
So my first book was called At the Water's Edge, and that talked about life coming on land and going back into the water as whales. And then Evolution, the Triumph of an Idea was a companion book to a television series. I wrote The Tangled Bank in 2000, and in the past decade, so much has happened in evolutionary biology. I almost kind of cringe when I go back and look at that first book because the human genome hadn't even been published yet, and the human genome is actually a treasure trove of information about our evolutionary origins. So in addition to all of the information there is to get from things like fossils, I have a whole lot in there about genes, about what we learn about evolution by looking at genes, by looking at to understand how embryos develop and how changing the rules of development can lead to major evolutionary changes, and looking, for example, at viruses. It turns out that we have a lot more viruses in our own DNA, believe it or not, than protein-coding genes. So all of that really, was very unclear 10 years ago. As much as possible in the textbook, I have, I'm talking about research in 2009, 2008. I was trying to make it kind of like reading a newspaper because I find the development so exciting.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Next question is coming from Bjorn Ostman. How much theory do you have in your book?
How much theory? Well, I don't have a lot of, I don't have lots of derivations of equations and so on. I do go into, the theory of evolution, the modern theory in terms of mutations and mutation rates, and in terms of selection, fitness, and things like that. But however much I can, I try to illustrate that with pictures, with diagrams, and also to really delve into concrete examples of this theory. So if talking about genetic drift, I mean, you have to understand a certain amount about statistics to understand how genetic drift happens, but there are some really compelling examples having to do with diseases that still linger with us, partly as a result of genetic drift.
Great. Thank you, Carl. We're going to do one more question before we wrap up and give out the 2 copies of your books. Question from Stephen Purcell. Was there anything that you encountered in research for previous books and or articles, as an example, Carl, with microcosm and parasite Rex, that made you decide to take on this current project? Or if you had already decided to create the current project when you were working on previous works, did the research there inform the current work?
Actually, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, Benjamin Roberts, a publisher, a textbook publisher, came to me and proposed this to me, and I thought it was a great idea. And I thought it was a great idea in part because I had been learning about so many new advances in evolution through these other books, like Microcosm. So, for example, that's a book about E. coli, and in my book, in the Tangled Bank, I actually get into some more detail about these great evolutionary experiments that are going on with E. coli. So, for example, a scientist named Richard Lenski has been allowing E. coli to evolve in his lab for 50,000 generations, which is just 20 years for you and me, but for E. coli, that's much more than a lifetime. And remarkably, one of the strains has kind of evolved in some bizarre direction and is effectively acting like it's a totally different species. So I've drawn on some of those things that I've learned in these previous books to inform the writing of this book, as well as the newspaper articles and magazine articles I've been working on.
That's very interesting. So thank you for sharing that, Carl, and for sharing your presentation today. We really have enjoyed it, and thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Your publisher, as you mentioned, Robertson Company, specifically Ben Roberts, has volunteered to donate 2 copies of your book. So if you wouldn't mind choosing a number between 1 and 30, we'll figure out who the first book recipient will be.
Okay, so I was thinking, okay, 2 numbers between, what was it, 1 and 67, right? So
1 and 30.
So the first one, so I'm going to do the first one will be 18.
Okay, Diane, can you share with us who the winner is?
It is Bjorn Ostman.
Great. Bjorn, if you wouldn't mind sending us your mailing address so that we can ship the book to you, we're delighted to share that with you. And your second number, Carl?
Well, I was thinking I should, so the second number should be between what range?
1 and 30 as well.
Oh, 1 and 30 as well. Okay. All right, so I did 18, so how about 23?
23? Okay, Diane, and the winner is?
Santiago Salinas.
Excellent. Santiago, if you could please send us your mailing address either by reply to your invitation to join the book party or through the chat, we'd be sure to get that in the mail for you. Okay, it's my pleasure to thank you again, Carl. It's been wonderful to hear from you today, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Chris Mooney, who's drafted this wonderful manuscript, Unscientific America. I have used this book itself as an anchor for giving presentations. I think the information in it is outstanding and wonderful, and I'm really excited to hear what you want to share with us today. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Sherry. It's great to be here, and I want to thank AIBS, and I want to thank Carl, and I don't know if I can embarrass him a little bit. I didn't hear mentioned that he just won the Kavli Award at the last meeting. Did we mention that?
I did not mention that.
So another big prize for one of our greatest science writers in the large newspaper category. So congratulations to Carl. So where do I start? Unscientific America. Let me tell you why I wrote this book, and I'll tell you by virtue of explaining my past. I'm the author of a previous book called The Republican War on Science, and many folks have probably heard of it, and I like to disclose at the beginning of talks that I was not trying to echo the cover image of another popular book that you may or may not be familiar with. The point of The Republican War on Science was really to take on the last administration, the Bush administration, for alleged crimes against scientific information in a variety of areas where politics were being placed ahead of science, and I and others documented that, and then I did the book about it. I think the ethos of the era is kind of epitomized by a scene in which President Bush was responding to questions following the catastrophic Christmas tsunami of 2004. And a journalist asked him, Mr. President, does the United States have a warning system in place for the purpose of detecting tsunamis? And Bush clearly didn't have a clue, and he hemmed and he hawed, and he finally said something like, well, I think we might be less vulnerable than other parts of the world. But then he quickly added, but I am not a geologist, as you know. And to me, that pretty much summarizes the relationship between the Bush administration and science. But the idea now is that everything has changed. We have a very different administration that is 180 degrees different in its policies on science, and in fact has explicitly set out to reverse various perceived slights against science by the Bush administration and has a 180-degree different position on climate change and, is already liberated stem cell research. So as I like to joke, scientists are back in Washington when you can see a guy with a beard at the signing ceremony for a bill. Scientists are back, and it's a very good thing, but the point of the new book, Unscientific America, is to say, don't necessarily get too comfortable because we might have a scientific White House, we don't have a scientific country, and if anything, any gains for science in its place in policy that may come under the Obama administration could be very quickly lost with just the turn of the elections this year, or certainly in 2012. So the idea then is to explore why America still has such a dysfunctional relationship with science, and that's the book. And here's the co-author, Cheryl. She is not unscientific. Let me just sort of run down the data. Carl had a little bit on evolution. There's much other data that shows where the public stands with respect to science. First, the factual knowledge data, which is sort of the most cited, most famous, but in some ways least important. But I'll just run through it. Everybody can read it. But a lot of Americans don't know electrons are smaller than atoms. A lot of Americans goof on Copernicanism. The Earth going around the sun. I like to joke, if you ask them about the cause of the seasons, you can just forget about it. Americans don't get the true-false question right about the Big Bang. I don't want to leave the impression that I think that this is the central nature of our problem, that people don't know enough facts, because that's certainly not what it is. It's much more complicated than that. To me and to Cheryl, it's at least as important, probably more important, that people are not engaged with the scientific community, scientific world, what it's doing, and they don't see how science affects their lives. And again, we can deduce various sorts of polling data to show this. So only 18% of Americans know a scientist personally, just 13% follow science news. Science news is in decline, and their interest in it is also apparently in decline. And this one that really staggers me, if you ask them, in a survey, can you name a scientific role model, then you get 44% who are just sort of, kind of like Bush getting that question about if the United States has a tsunami warning system. It's like they do not have an answer. And among those that do have an answer, it's not really much more heartening because these are the top three choices. So what that means is that America's top scientific role models are either not scientists, or they're not alive. And that tells you about the place of science in our current society more than probably anything else does. And then, of course, with this backdrop, if a scientific issue gets politicized, then you can pretty much assume that it's not going to be handled well or functionally, and that we're going to tear each other's hair out about it. We have the anti-evolution figures, 46% think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. The gap between scientists and the public is widening, apparently, based on the latest data on climate change and whether it's real and human caused. So scientists overwhelmingly on one side, public overwhelmingly on the other, and you can sort of do the same breakdown on many other science-relevant policy topics like vaccination, like stem cell research, and whether it should be supported. I think one of the most important aspects of thinking about this is, sure, there's a problem when it comes to the relationship between science and the public, and the data I've shown help delineate the nature of the problem. But what is its cause? I do not think that stupidity on the part of the public is the cause. I do not think that just broad, widespread ignorance, though in some sense it may exist, is the cause. In fact, I can show you data in this slide showing precisely the opposite. This is the correlation between political party affiliation, level of education, and belief in global warming. And what it shows is, this is Pew data, and it shows that if you are a Republican, then the higher your level of education, the less likely you are to accept scientific reality, i.e. that global warming is real and human caused. But if you are a Democrat or an independent, precisely the opposite is the case. So more schooling doesn't necessarily make you more pro-science. If anything, it might make you more adept at coming up with or finding on the web or, posting to a blog anti-science sorts of arguments. You might be better at making that case, the rhetorical case that supports your politics that you had to begin with. And we see something similar on another topic where here I'll whack the left rather than the right, the topic of vaccination. I call this slide Dumb and Dumber. But again, it's the elites who are actually skeptical of vaccines, those who do not vaccinate their children, tend to be people who are more well-to-do and better educated. And because they're better educated, they feel empowered to go out and inform themselves about the issue. And so they research it on the Internet, what Jenny McCarthy called the University of Google, and then they misinform themselves. And then we have the vaccine problem of the sort that we do right now. So I want to stop here and just take a step back and say, well, why do we care? Why is scientific literacy something that anybody would worry about? After all, it's been pointed out to me in many of the interviews that I've done about the book that, hey, Americans aren't exactly historically literate. You can't name the founders, blah, blah. Americans might not even be particularly literate, period. Yes, science is a unique case, though, and the case for scientific literacy runs as follows. In all these areas, knowledge, having it better than not to have it, I think we would agree about that. Scientific knowledge is particularly empowering in the sense that scientific thinking, critical thinking, the ability to weigh evidence and determine how strong it is, if applied in an individual life, can have quite a lot of benefits, such as, for example, when you're trying to figure out what to do in important medical decisions. Scientific engagement also has important implications for citizenship. And in fact, I think the most important aspect of scientific literacy is being aware of the way in which science affects policy, how much the government is spending on research, what kind of benefit you as a citizen are getting from that, and what ways science is playing into or failing to play into the decisions that are being made by leaders, so that ultimately scientific literacy, we hope, would influence policy because people would elect more scientifically savvy representatives, and then we would align our decisions more with the way the world actually works. Such is the theory. Anyway, and I want to emphasize that that would be true for issues that we are currently fighting over in the moment, like climate change, and it would be true for issues that we will have to grapple with in the future, like, say, this one it's almost grappling with in the present now for geoengineering. It seems like there was more talk about geoengineering at the latest American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting than there was talk about just global warming, but this is the plan to remake the stratosphere. If we can't stop global warming the old-fashioned way of cutting emissions, we'll just rejigger the planet a little bit, give it a parasol to reflect sunlight away from the Earth, and maybe that's how we'll solve the problem. The other slide is meant to denote synthetic biology, which is coming on strong soon, the idea that we can actually create life in the laboratory and design it for various purposes, which I expect may trigger some public resistance once it becomes more widely known that this sort of thing is in the cards. I'm not sure where I am. I only want to talk for 15 minutes, but I'm just going to go on and see where that gets me, perhaps a little bit longer. The next question that usually, and of course, Sherry, let me know if I'm going too long, but the next question that comes up is, how did America get to be so messed up with respect to science? If we're dysfunctional, when did we cease to function? Or did we never function? And I guess my answer to that is that there was an era that was different. And that era is the late 1950s and the early 1960s, when America was all about science. And that happened for a very specific reason. The Soviets fired Sputnik. We were terrified that we were falling behind, and so we did everything that we possibly could to catch up, including launching a space program, creating the National Science Foundation, and NASA to launch that space program, investing heavily in not only high school but also university-based science education and training, and basically making science at that time. Oh, and also adding scientific advice to the White House. That's when all of the scientific advisory apparatus was created, and just spending suddenly much larger amounts of money on scientific research. So modern American science was forged during this period of political and cultural focus on science. And since then, I don't think anyone can really argue anything but that there's been a decline in the prominence, even if the 50s and 60s were perhaps an artificial high. And some figures from Pew in 2009, I think, highlight that, because they show that just over a decade, Americans are much less likely now than they were 10 years ago to describe scientific advances as one of our most important achievements, or to name the moon landing as the most important achievement. So we've lost some sense of that spirit of, the 60s, the early 60s, and the 50s. And as the decline occurred, one of the key themes of the book, and something I'd like to stress, is that it's not scientists' fault that the decline occurred, but it certainly is the case that the scientists didn't always help themselves counter it, and the great example here is what happened to Carl Sagan, hands down the greatest science communicator of a generation. He reached audiences in the millions, by being on Johnny Carson regularly. Cosmos was PBS's greatest success ever, as I understand it, and ultimately reached 500 million people around the globe. And its Hollywood Film Contact has assuredly reached millions as well, and he sold millions of books. So Sagan was a science celebrity of a sort that we arguably don't even have any longer, and he did some pretty good planetary science. And if he was still with us, I think it's safe to say that he'd be very engaged on an issue like climate change. But when his bid for membership in 1992 came up before the National Academy of Sciences, it didn't get through. Enough of the Academy's members thought that Sagan should not be a member, that it was possible to prevent it going through. And the reasons, we don't know exactly what happened in the room, but the reasons tend to be given that he was too much of a popularizer. He dumbed the science down. His scientific achievements weren't good enough, even if his popularization achievements were. That kind of thinking is something that we're highly critical of in the book, and it's a good thing that I think that kind of thinking is going away, is in decline, and is not nearly as strong as it used to be. And in our call for scientists to communicate and to be more effective, we've just been given in the last couple of months the greatest argument yet for why that's so important. It's not just to reach the public and cause some kind of great enlightenment. Scientists should become better communicators and respect those in their ranks who are good communicators, because that's the way to protect themselves from vicious attacks of the sort that recently occurred in the ClimateGate scandal, when emails were exposed, private emails from a group of scientists, and suddenly the mass media was blasting all of climate research and claiming that all sorts of untoward things had gone on the part of these scientists, when really they were just going about doing normal research, and nobody really wants to have their emails read. And when you look into the specific charges of what was allegedly done, the deleting of emails, or that were subject to freedom of information requests, or a quote trick in representing the data, and all these things turn out to be, there's no there to the charges. But in the moment when this all came up, scientists did not know how to head off a scandal like this. And in fact, one of them, Mike Mann, told me that he was trying to communicate and he just didn't have that much help from the scientific community. So there's a lot of thinking going on right now about how to better respond and how to better protect scientific knowledge. And we think our book is part of the case for why we need to invest much more strongly in doing that. I think that's probably taken me to 15, so I'm gonna cut it off, although I could do more. Thank you.
Sure, Chris. You brought it right up to time, so you did a great job with the timing on your presentation. And that ClimateGate was a really interesting scandal, so thank you for sharing more information about that with us. We do have a question already from Caitlin. She asks clearly, the U.S. desperately needs more STEM researchers. How do we get our college students to go into a STEM-related field of research and ensure that they are scientifically literate if more education does not always correlate with greater scientific literacy?
It's tough. I mean, first of all, I'm going to problematize a little bit the first aspect of the question, because I'm in favor of training more scientists. But if I'd gone on, I would have presented data showing that we do not have jobs for the scientists that we currently create. And in fact, the chance of a graduate student, PhD today, under 35, getting a faculty job, tenure-track faculty position, if I can actually find that slide, has declined to something like 7%. So part of the problem is that there are not enough opportunities right now in academic science, and part of our argument is, here's the slide, and part of our argument is that we need to create different kinds of opportunities for young people who have some interest in science, but don't necessarily go all the way to the PhD. They get off somewhere along the way, along the pipeline, and they find a different sort of position that helps, where they're working to connect science with the public. And I would incentivize those kinds of jobs as well and cast a broader net. And I would say that we don't need just PhDs. We need all kinds of people with scientific knowledge who are engaging the rest of the public that doesn't necessarily have it as much. I guess I'll take another question.
Okay. Ido Friedberg, if you'd like to ask your question now, *7 to unmute.
Well, it was pretty much answered in the answer to the previous one about the fact that scientific career is considered to be extremely financially risky, and that most scientists in the U.S. are actually not U.S. residents. Most postdocs are foreign. So my question would be, do do you suggest some sort of public policy change since most science in the U.S. is publicly funded?
Oh, I don't know that I would go that far. I mean, I think that the United States gets a lot from scientists from other countries who come here to study and do research, and the figures I've seen, I don't have them handy, but the figures I've seen suggest that large numbers of them stay and contribute to our economy. So it's not like it's a bad thing for us, I guess, or not. I mean, it might ultimately say something about our competitiveness in the world, but it might ultimately just say that's the world that we live in and better get used to.
Great. Ido, any follow-up questions to that? Okay, Jen Skeen, would you like to dial in and ask your question? *7 to unmute your phone.
I put up since there are these questions about the workforce, I put up my scientific workforce slide, by the way, here, so everybody can see it, about China racing up from behind in terms of total production of PhDs, but U.S. numbers still rising. Yes?
Chris, I was wondering, you were involved in Science Debate 2008 and in the establishment of the Coalition on the Public Understanding of Science, which are two grassroots movements. How do you think grassroots movements can be effective in improving scientific literacy?
Well, I think that in many ways, especially if they mobilize and connect lots of people, and I think that's the central aspect of it is, they have to be netroots movements, and they have to really use social networking tools to the best of their ability. And that's the new challenge, is to get, 4,000 people or 20,000 people and get them all on Facebook and feed them scientific information and give them ways to then spread it even more broadly. And I'm happy to say that with the Science Debate Initiative, partly because of the focus on the election, someone else would be better to speak to COPA's achievements because I was at the early meetings, but I don't know enough detail to speak about them. The Science Debate, we really did, we really touched a chord, and we had 36,000 people that we were then, able to send out our releases and our information to and keep them focused on science in the election. That's a key way to do it, and I hope that movement will continue when the next major election comes around.
It was really appropriate that Jen asked that question because she's a regional hub liaison for the COPAS network. Since Chris kind of left that open to talk about COPAS as a grassroots movement, Jen, do you want to chime in with some of the achievements of that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so COPAS is just sort of a network for folks that don't know of all kinds of science organizations that have just sort of banded together to improve, public understanding of science, like the name suggests. And I think we've been able to really tap out into, sort of beyond the web into different communities, and where we've really been effective is just kind of motivating people to maybe do what they've already been doing, or maybe just have a little bit of support in putting together, science events and things like that. So I think it's kind of exciting to think about a network, but not just via the internet, but building a community as well.
Great, thanks. Do we have any additional questions for Chris? Okay, great. Chris, can you please select for us a number 30 to figure out who the winner of your book is?
13.
13. Diane, can you tell us who number 13 is?
Brad Grinnell.
Brad, you have won a copy of...
Fred,
I'm sorry. Fred Grinnell. Hey, Fred, you have won a copy of Unscientific America, Chris's latest book. Congratulations. If you could please send us your address, we'll make sure that gets shipped to you. Chris, so would you like to select another number?
Sure. It's too thin to serve as a doorstop, but so you might want to actually read it. 7.
Number 7.
Pat Wagman.
Pat Wagman? Pat Wagman, you have also won a copy of the book. If you could please send us an email with your address by replying to the Ready Talk invitation or in the chat, we'd be happy to send that along to you. And the third one, Chris?
24.
24.
Alana Riviera.
Alana Riviera, congratulations. We'd like to thank your publisher, Chris, Basic Books, for providing those books as door prizes at this event. It was really nice of them to offer those up.
Yep, they're good people over there.
It seems like it. They were really responsive. So, Lana, congratulations on your book. Please send us your address so we can send it over to you. All right, great. Well, if there's any additional questions for Chris or Carl, we'd be happy to help ask those questions at this time. And if not, I'll give you a minute here to ask a question by chat or to unmute your phone by dialing *7. All right, great. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope that you've enjoyed this experience and have found it useful for you. As you close out your window from the webinar, a feedback form will appear, and if you'd like to just share your thoughts with us to let us know if this is the kind of stuff you'd like to see more of in the future and do more of, I'd be happy to help facilitate it if it's something that's useful for the community. Big thanks to Chris and Carl. You guys are both extraordinary, and you're great friends of AIBS, and we're really, really happy to have the chance to help promote these books. They're great books, and we're just happy to help share them. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. I will see more of you guys when I move to Washington, D.C., likely in May, so I will be closer to AIBS, and I'll be dropping in all the time. You'll get sick of me.
Looking forward to it, Chris, truly. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.